is Carrie, Chapter 3, Part 2 of Chapter 3. But what should I do? I figured I could break out one of the windows and squeeze through. Once I was out, it wouldn't be no trouble getting away, even though my arms was tied down. The big problem was whether one of them men outside was the kidnapper. If it was, I'd be better off waiting until dark, when maybe he'd go off to get his supper, or would get sleepy, or would figure I wasn't able to find a way to escape. But if I waited too long, they might load me on the ship and lock me in the hold, and once I was on board, there wasn't no way I could escape short of throwing myself into the water and drowning. No, it didn't make no sense to wait, so I hobbled back over to the window, feeling mighty trembly. I took a deep breath to calm myself down, then I leaned my shoulders, which was pretty well protected by the bag, against the window, just pushing steady, and in a minute it cracked and fell to pieces. I leapt back and looked out, and my heart sank. The man, who had been leaning on the corner of the building smoking, shoved the pipe into his coat pocket and came running toward me. I pushed my face down by the broken window and began to shout, "Help! Help! Help!" as loud as I could. Some of the people around stopped what they was doing and looked up. "Help!" I shouted, but the kidnapper was at the door, clinking his key. I hobbled over behind the door. It swung open and the kidnapper ran in. I was out from behind the door and around it like a shot and into the street. But it was useless, trussed up the way I was. He was on me in 2 steps, grabbed hold of the bag, and started to pull me back toward the storehouse. And that was when I saw Dan. That was when I seen Dan and Mr. Francis trotting along the street. "Dan!" I shouted, and the next thing I knew, Mr. Francis had the kidnapper by the arm and was shaking him. Dan grabbed him by the other arm, and they shoved him up against the side of the little low warehouse where they had captured me. "Let go of me," the kidnapper shouted. "Oh, no," Mr. Francis said. "You're going straight down to the jail." That worried the kidnapper some. He gave Mr. Francis a look, and then me, and he spit onto the cobblestones and looked back at Mr. Francis. "Let go of me," he growled. "You ain't got no right to hold me." He tried to jerk loose, but Mr. Francis banged his shoulder hard onto the kidnapper and slammed him back against the wall. It hurt him, and he winced. Then he said, "You ain't got no right to hold me. That little nigger girl don't belong to you." Mr. Francis gave a kind of a jump. He stared at the kidnapper hard. "Who told you that?" he said. The kidnapper looked away. "None of your business how I know." Mr. Francis gave the kidnapper a shake by the arm. "I'll make it my business," he said in a rough voice. "I seen legal papers," the kidnapper said. "You ain't her rightful owner." Well, it was all pretty surprising to me, and mystifying too, but maybe the kidnapper was lying. Mr. Francis gave him another shake. "Who hired you?" he shouted. The kidnapper pulled himself up straight and looked at Mr. Francis direct, like he knew he had the upper hand. "I ain't going to tell you," he said, "and if you take me into court, I'll prove that you ain't her rightful owner." Mr. Francis stood there holding on to the kidnapper, his eyes narrowed, thinking. Dan stared at him and me, and the kidnapper too. Then Mr. Francis said quietly, "Let him go, Dan." They backed off from the kidnapper, and he slipped away from the wall. Mr. Francis raised his arm and pointed his finger into the kidnapper's face. "But if I see you anywhere near my tavern again, I'll have the stable boys beat you within an inch of your life," he shouted. "Is that clear?" The kidnapper gave Mr. Francis a quick look, spit on the cobblestones, and strolled off down the street, lighting up his pipe as he went. Well, I was confused all right. It seemed clear enough that the kidnapper wasn't lying. I looked up at Mr. Francis. "Sir, who do I belong to, then?" He gave me a hard look. "As far as you're concerned, you belong to me. Just leave it at that." "Please, sir, it ain't fair. It's mighty hard not knowing who you are." I went on looking up at him. "Please, sir." He shook his head. "I didn't want any of this to get out. It's bad." "Please, sir." He thought some more and then said, "I guess they found out some of it," he said, sort of to himself. I suppose I might as well tell you this much anyway. The man who brought you to the tavern was Jack Erebus." "Dan's daddy?" I looked at Dan, and Dan looked at me. "Why didn't you tell me, Dan?" He He shook his head. I didn't know anything about it until this minute. Sir, I said. He held up his hand. I'm sorry this much has gotten out. That's all I'm going to say about it. We'll drop it there. He gave me a serious look. But from now on, keep a sharp eye out for yourself, Carrie. And I was mighty sure I would.